Well, let's look in the scriptures today to Daniel chapter 3. Daniel chapter 3. It's good to have you in worship with us. Good to have those who are online worshiping with us. And today, as we look at God's word, may He open it up, make it alive, make it real for us, and apply it to our lives. So if you haven't joined us on our daily Bible reading, going through the book of Daniel, it's on the YouVersion Bible app. I'd encourage you to join us. We're all joined together. And if you want to figure out how to do that, someone will be at the Guest Information Center to help you out. This week, there was a devotion that was in that Bible reading, and the author made this point. She said that any good story has a through line. And a through line is that kind of central theme that goes throughout the entire story. It's the narrative that continues to come back. It's the spine that kind of holds the whole story together. So let me kind of illustrate. These were some of the illustrations she used. The first one I'm going to illustrate is the story that is found in the Star Wars series. Now, when I decided I was going to share this, I got a little nervous because the last time I shared a Star Wars story, I got 2 or 3 came afterwards and said, you got the names all wrong. I don't think they got anything out of the sermon, but they were aware that I got all the names wrong. So, in Star Wars, I think I've got this right, the line through the narrative is kind of Luke Skywalker's trying to understand being a Jedi and how that changes everything. If I didn't get that right, just ignore what I just said, all right? Next is the Avengers. Some of you guys like the Avengers and kind of that whole series. And I think the through line in all of that is the fact that they are going to overcome evil in the world. They're going to save the world, and they do it almost every time you watch the movie. All right, so if none of those made sense, I had to kind of get it to where I understand. So there is a through line in the Antiques Roadshow. And it's something like this. There's treasure in your trash, all right? Am I making sense here today, guys? Okay, so Daniel, the whole book, has this through line or this narrative that continues to be repeated, and you just find it throughout. It's what holds the whole story together. And this is Daniel's through line. Daniel is confident that God is in charge. I mean, he's confident that God is sovereign, that God is in charge of who is in charge, that God is all-powerful, almighty, and no matter what life throws at Daniel, is that God is ultimately in full control. It weaves throughout the whole story. We'll see it again and again and again. So it is very evident in the story we're going to read today, and the story we're reading today does not include Daniel, but if you grew up in the church or you've studied the Bible for a while, this is a story that all of us love. It's an amazing story of God's redemption and power and the fact that God is in charge. So we're going to look at verses 1 through 18. I'm going to read them all to you, so if you won't mind, just follow along with me. King Nebuchadnezzar made a gold statue, 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide, and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then he sent messengers to the high officers, officials, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, and magistrates. Actually, in the old King James, magistrates says sheriffs, if that makes it a little bit better for you. All the providential officials to come to the dedication of the statue he had set up. And so these officials came and stood before the statue King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And then a herald shouted out, "People of all races, nations, language, listen to the king's command and hear the sound. When you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and all the musical instruments, bow down to the ground to worship King Nebuchadnezzar's gold statue. Anyone who refuses to obey will be immediately thrown into the blazing, fiery furnace." So at the sound of musical instruments, all the people, wherever their race or nation or language, bowed to the ground and worshiped the gold statue King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. But some of the astrologers went to the king and informed on the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "Long live the king. You issued a decree requiring all people to bow down and worship the gold statue when they hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, harps, pipes, and musical instruments. That decree also states that those who refuse to obey must be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who have been put in charge of the province of Babylon, and they pay no attention to you, your majesty. They refuse to serve your gods and do not worship the gold statue that you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar flew into a rage and ordered that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought before him. And when they were brought in, Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you refuse to serve my gods or worship the gold statue that I have set up? I will give you one more chance to bow and worship that statue I have made, and when you hear the sound of the musical instruments. But if you refuse, you will be thrown immediately into the blazing furnace. And then what God is going to be able to rescue you from my power?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you. If we are thrown into the fiery furnace, the God in whom we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power, your majesty. But even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear, your majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have set up." It's a great, great story. And what we find is King Nebuchadnezzar has gone out on the plain of Dura, which is about 6 miles outside of the city of Babylon, and he has put this statue up that is 90 feet tall. And you might think of it kind of almost like the Washington Monument. So everyone in Babylon can look out on that plain and they can see this gold image of their king glistening in the sun. Now, I think there's a reason why he did this, and I think that reason is given to us in chapter 2. Last chapter, we studied the fact that King Nebuchadnezzar had this dream, and it was about this statue, and he goes to Daniel and says, "Well, tell me what this means," and Daniel says, "Here's what it means. First of all, the golden head represents your kingdom, Nebuchadnezzar." And then what Daniel does is he goes through the list, and he says, "And your kingdom is going to be replaced by another, and another, and another, and another, and eventually the kingdom of God is going to rule over all." So every kingdom was represented by a different kind of metal, and King Nebuchadnezzar's was represented by gold. And so what kind of statue does he choose to represent himself? A gold statue. What is he saying? My kingdom is never going to end. Daniel, I don't care what you interpret. I don't care what you say about your God who's going to reign forever. My kingdom is going to reign forever. And here's an example of why. King Nebuchadnezzar has an issue. That's really two issues. I'll talk about both of them today. One is that he is a prideful person. We see that in his life just in these first few chapters. He's prideful, he's self-centered, he's narcissistic, he's egotistical. It's all about King Nebuchadnezzar. But in the next chapter, we are going to find that this man of great ego is humbled in a very challenging way. You got to stick around for it. But he eventually finds himself in a very challenging situation because of his pride. In Proverbs it says, God opposes the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. It's Nebuchadnezzar's pride that gets him in trouble. It's our pride that continues to get us in trouble. And I think what I hear as I'm reading this story and as I look at what the king has done and what eventually happens is that God is reminding him and reminding us that none of us are indispensable. That there will be one who follows along behind us. God is at work. He can do his purposes, and you can use us, or we can choose to do our own thing. And the king says in his pride, I'm going to build a statue, and everybody's going to bow down and worship it, because my kingdom is going to last forever. So next, what we find is that, so he calls this kind of public meeting. He gets all of the officials that are a part of his land, all of the commoners, and he says to them, he says, all right, when the king's band blows their horns, when they begin to play, here's the plan. You are all going to bow down to this golden statue and worship this image. Now, something that's interesting about this passage is, one, this is not just like a political convention where they get everybody in, and we're going to talk about the stuff that's going on in our world, and the king's got this great speech. This is not a political convention. This is a worship service. Because if you look in just those 18 verses that we read, worship is mentioned 7 times. So this is not just a rally to kind of get folks excited about what's going on in the nation. This is a worship service, and the king has put the band together. He's got emotion going on. It's almost like the Olympics opening ceremony. So there's enormous pressure for all of them to bow down to this idol. Well, folks, it's 2021. And there may not be gold statues outside the city for us to bow down, but we have all sorts of idols. Actually, here's what Pastor Martin Lloyd Jones says. An idol is anything in our lives that occupies the place that should be occupied by God alone. Anything that is central in my life, anything that seems to be essential. An idol is anything by which I live and which I depend. Anything that holds such a controlling position in my life that it moves, rouses, and attracts too much of my time, attention, energy, and money. John Calvin said, mankind has become an idol-making factory. Anything, did you hear what the end of that quote from Jones was? He says, anything that controls my life, my time, my attention and energy and money and replaces God as number one in my life, that is an idol. Now, in our materialistic society, our deities are no longer objects that need to be appeased or placated, kind of like what it is in this story, but rather things that appease and placate us. Our idols have gone from, I have to appease the idol, now it is, the idol needs to appease me. The idol somehow needs to make my life better, somehow bring peace to me, somehow bring satisfaction, that we somehow believe that God is unable to do so. And so in this moment, everyone is called to bow down to this idol. Unfortunately, we find ourselves continue to be tempted with idolatry in our society because they're all around us, these things that we're tempted to bow down to give allegiance to replace God in our life. Now, here's what's interesting. As I was studying this, most biblical scholars believe that this idol that King Nebuchadnezzar made out of gold was not made out of solid gold. Rather, it was made out of wood and it was covered with gold. And as I read that, I thought, well, that's really a perfect illustration for an idol. Because an idol to us, it glimmers, it attracts, it pulls us towards it. But when you get to it, when you get a part of it, you realize this thing is empty and it is hollow and it has nothing to offer me. But unfortunately, what happens in our idols is that they're empty and they have nothing to offer us, yet we keep going back to them, hoping that they are going to fill up the emptiness in our life in which God has created a hole that only He can fill, and we keep going to the idols, hoping they're going to make the difference. So the king is saying everyone is going to have to worship this idol. And it is a reminder to us that we were created for one purpose, and that is to worship God and God alone. And no one or nothing will ever fill up that emptiness and fill our deepest and longest needs. So, what did they do? Well, it says in verse 7, so at the sound of the musical instruments, all the people, whatever the race or nation or language, bowed to the ground and worshiped the gold statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. The music plays and everybody falls, except. It says that some of the astrologers went to King Nebuchadnezzar and said, hey, everybody bow down. I find it interesting, they repeat the musical instruments several times in this, just to make sure you knew what was going on. So everybody bowed down when the band played, King, but there are some Jews named Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego who, when the band struck up, they didn't bow. Now, I think it kind of fits into what happened in chapter 2. Daniel comes in, interprets the dream, and kind of shows up these astrologers, these wise men. And I'm certain what's going on here is that they have become jealous and they're trying to save their job. And so they want to make sure that the king understands, hey, there's some Jews who you've put in place of authority, who you've given some places of authority in the country, and they are not doing what you said they should do. And king, if you remember right, you're going to throw them in the furnace, right? If they don't do what you asked them to do. Well, it says in verse 13, this is the second thing that Nebuchadnezzar seems to do on a pretty regular basis. Verse 13, it says, he flew into a rage, and he ordered Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to be brought before him. Here's the two issues you see with this king. One, he's a prideful man, and secondly, he can conquer cities and he can conquer countries, but he just can't seem to conquer himself. It says that his anger was so great that he flew into a rage. I want him here. I'm putting him in the furnace. I can't believe that they have done what they have done. They have disobeyed. And anger seems to dominate this king's decisions. James said this about anger. He says, and don't sin by letting anger control you. Don't let the sun go down while you're still angry, for anger gives a foothold to the devil. James says here, he says, don't let anger control your decision processes. And then he gives us this adage, that this kind of proverb that we've heard before is, don't let the sun go down on your anger. In essence, for married couples, don't go to bed angry at each other. Sometimes you may have to stay up all night long, but do not go to bed angry with each other. But I think if you dig a little further into that scripture, here's what I believe James is saying is, don't let anger become your companion. Don't let anger become your companion. Don't let it find its way into your heart and your life and control you and bring bitterness into your life and frustration, that where you find that when the stress is on, your immediate response is in anger. In our language, we have something that we say that when someone gets angry, or we may say it about ourselves, I flew off the handle. I flew off the handle. I lost it. Now that adage or that illustration is about pretty much like a hammer that has a head on it, and it says, I flew off the handle. Here's the two things you know if that happened to you. Number one, you are useless. Just like that hammer without a head, you are useless. If you get angry and you can't control it, we all know it. We're useless. We say things, we do things. The anger is controlling us and not ourself or even the power of God. And the second thing, if the head flies off the hammer, and there's somebody close by, they're going to get what? They're going to get hit, they're going to get hurt. Same things with anger. We're useless, and somebody's going to get hurt. Well, that's exactly what's happening here with King Nebuchadnezzar. He just flies off the handle. He loses it. He says, bring them in here, and we're going to do something about these boys. So it says that he brought them in, and he gave them another chance. It says, so he brought in the Jews, and they said, your majesty, they refuse to worship your gods and do not worship you, or the golden idol that you have set up. And before I read just a little bit further, here's a question that comes up when you read this passage. Where was Daniel? We got Daniel in Daniel 1, Daniel 2. He's kind of the main character. We come to Daniel chapter 3. We've got a golden idol. We got everybody bowing down. We don't hear anything about Daniel. Our thought is that, he of course is not bowing down. He's already made it pretty clear who he stands for. Certainly he wasn't bowing down. So where is he? We're going to talk about that next week. So hang on to that. So the question is as you read this and you hear that these guys are unwilling to bow to this idol, one of the things that has to come to our mind is, would I be able to do the same thing? If there was that kind of pressure to bow, to worship, to put something else in front of God, it was commanded by the officials in the land, would I have the strength to stand when everybody else was bowing? Or would I say something like, you know what, I'm standing on the outside, but I'm bowing, or, I'm bowing on the outside, but standing on the inside? Or would I say, you know what, God's going to forgive me if I do it, God's a forgiving God, or that's what the work says I have to do, that's what everybody else is doing? Here's one of the things we have to think about. Our faith doesn't have loopholes. It doesn't have these loopholes that, well, if, sort of, kind of, there might be some negotiation here. Our faith is simply obey God and know that He knows what's best for us. When we're in situations that don't make sense, that are overwhelming, that seem to be challenging our faith, those are moments when we have to say, this may not make sense, I may not understand it, but God has commanded it, God has directed it, I know this is the right thing to do, no loopholes, no excuses, this is what God has asked, no arguments, I will do it. And that is that point of going back to the initial of what Daniel teaches us, is that we trust that God is in control of all of the things around us, and we can trust Him even when we feel like we're about ready to give up. And the next question comes to us is that where did these guys learn this? How did they become strong enough in their faith that if the entire country is bowing down to this idol, they were still strong enough to stand? Where did this start? I think it started, at least we get a glimpse of it, in Daniel chapter 1. And it started in the king's cafeteria. Because in Daniel 1, it says, these guys have been taken from their homeland. The king says, I want you to learn what I know. I want to feed you like you should be fed. And I want you to eat all of the king's delicacies right here. You get to be in the king's cafeteria. And they said, this is not the food we should eat. It will defile us, and we're not going to do it. It may have been a small moment compared to this moment, but it is in the small moments of faithfulness and obedience to what God wants us to do. It's in those moments that we get strength for the big moments that come upon us. It's in the daily disciplines. It's in the commitment every day of saying, you know what, that's not what is best for me. That's what God would want for me. I will choose to do that when everybody's watching or if they're not watching. Those are the moments in which we draw strength to be able to stand tall when everybody else is bowing. So what happened to these guys? Well, King Nebuchadnezzar brings them in and he says this, is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you refuse to serve my gods or to worship the gold statue I've set up? I'll give you one more chance to bow down and worship the statue that I have made, and when you hear the sound of the musical instruments. But if you refuse, you're going to be thrown immediately into the fiery furnace, and I don't think your God's going to save you. King Nebuchadnezzar, what a generous guy. He says, I was going to kill you on the first time, but I'm going to give you a second chance. But ultimately, I kind of think that's like the enemy anyway. When he hits us with a temptation, once you overcome that temptation, don't count on him to give up on that. He's going to circle back around, and he's going to try to get you again in another way. So here's the king. He says, all right, I'm going to give you another chance. And now let's listen to their response. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied, Nebuchadnezzar, we don't need to defend ourselves before you. Now notice who's the priority in their life. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God in which we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power. But even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, Your Majesty, that we're never going to serve your gods or worship this gold statue. There's a statement in there that you got to let resonate for a minute. They say God's going to save us, but he may not save us. But we want to make it clear. Another translation says, let it be known, King, we're not bowing. I think all of us have to have some time, some moments in our lives, the let it be known moments. The pressure's on, temptation to do different things that could be destructive and harmful, to put idols in front, and we just have to stand tall and say, let it be known. Let it be known, I'm not going down this route. Let it be known, I will have no idols in my life. Let it be known, and let it be clear, I'm standing tall for my God. We all have to have those moments in our life of faith. Now here's a question that again comes up. What's the issue? What's the big deal about the idol? Why these guys, why are they willing to even die to make sure that they don't worship this idol. And I think we probably know the answer, but it goes back to Exodus chapter 20. It's 10 commandments. And this is what God said about it. And I wanted to make sure that we put it in context of what's going on. In Exodus 20, verses 2 through 6, this is what it says. It says, I am the Lord your God who rescued you out of the land of Egypt, the place of your slavery. You must not have any other God but me. You must not make for yourself an idol of any kind of image in anything in the heavens or on the earth or in the sea. You must not bow down to them or worship them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, and I will not tolerate your affection for other gods. Now listen to this last part, because I think this is one that we don't read often. I lay the sins of parents upon their children. The entire family is affected. Even children in their third and their fourth generations of those who reject me. But I lavish unfailing love for 1,000 generations on those who love me and obey my commands. So, why shouldn't we have idols? What's the issue? An idol is any person, I'll read this again, an object or activity you give a higher priority in your life than your relationship with God. God is to have no rivals in our life. God is the one true God, and He deserves all of our worship. He says here, look what I've done. I am your God, and you're going to be my people. But there's this one part, that He says that if idol worship is in your life, it will affect future generations. If our children see that we have idols, those things in our life that seem to bring us satisfaction and peace, bring us self-confidence, that are outside of God, that we just kind of keep going back to them. And they've gotten out of line in our life, and they've become more important than they should have. If our children witness this in our life, when times get difficult and times get stressful in their lives as they grow and mature, there's going to be a temptation for them to look back at mom and dad and say, what did mom and dad do when the stress was on? Who did they turn to when things got difficult? Where did they find their self-worth? Where did they find their value? And if we have chosen to put something there besides God, our children will be tempted, He's saying to us here, will be tempted to worship that same idol. He says this is a generational issue. If we don't solve it here, it could be passed on to our kids and to our grandkids and to our great-grandkids. This is an idol that they continue to deal with. But I'll give you just the opposite. He says, yet, if you worship me, if you make me number one, if you have no idols before me, He says, I will bless not only you, but 1,000 generations to come. If you focus on me, if you put me first, then it will not only affect you, but 1,000 generations will be affected by your faithfulness to God today. So why no idols? Because God deserves all the honor, glory, and praise, and also it affects generations what we choose to do with them. Well, let's just kind of end it up here. They say, you know what, King? If you throw us in the fiery furnace, our God, He's powerful enough. He's going to save us. But this is a really important part of the statement. But if He doesn't, if for some reason He doesn't answer the prayers as we would hope to, I want you to know, we're not going to bow down. They're saying, if God does things like I want Him to or not, because He is my God, because He is our God, we are confident that He knows what is best. And if He chooses to save us or He chooses to allow us to go through the fire, it doesn't matter. We're not going to worship anyone else because He is our God, and we believe that He is the one true sovereign God, and no one else deserves worship, and we trust Him if our prayers get answered the way we want them to or not. Now, we've got a lot of confusion about that, and I think just in the church and the Christian world. We somehow think that God is at our beck and call. And that God's going to do what we ask him to do, almost like he works for us. And what these children, or these three teenagers are teaching us is that it's not a consumeristic faith. God can do whatever God wants to do. I am his to be used however he wants. And he is not at my beck and call. Ultimately, I believe that he is faithful and he will walk with me if my prayer is answered like I wanted to, or if it is not. We're still going to serve him. Because it's not about what we get out of it, it's about who he is and what we were created to do, and that is to serve and worship the one true living God. Dr. Stan Toller, some of you I'm sure have read some of his books. He's written countless, and there's one book that if you get it, it's worth the purchase just for the title. And the title is, God Has Never Failed Me, but He Scared Me to Death a Few Times. And in that book, Stan tells a story. He tells a story about growing up in a small little village, actually a coal mining town in West Virginia. His dad was a coal miner. They had next to nothing, 3 brothers. They lived in kind of a one-room house with a potbelly stove. And he said every Saturday they would go to the company store. In other words, the coal mine owned it, and that was where they would buy their things. He said every Saturday we'd go to the company store, and while mom and dad were shopping, he said my brothers and I would stand in front of the window where the black and white TV was, and we would get to watch our shows every week. He said it was a highlight. But he said he said I'll never forget this Saturday. I'll just read it to you. He says, one of the saddest days of my childhood was a Saturday morning when we returned home from a visit to the company store to see our tiny home engulfed in flames. We lost everything, and he says, I cried for days. He said, years later, Pastor Richard Grindstaff, their pastor at the time, told us that as the house was burning to the ground, and he was standing beside Stan's father, watching them lose everything, the pastor said that Stan's dad put his arm around him, and these were his words: the Lord giveth, and the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. That's a statement, isn't it? This doesn't make sense. This is painful. The Lord giveth, the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. I will trust in him. These words from Job. I think that's what these 3 Hebrew children are saying. No matter what comes, my God can be trusted. So the question is well, what happened? Did he throw them in the fiery furnace? Some of you already know what happened. But we're going to talk more about it next week. I want you to come back, all right? But let's go back to where we started. Do we trust God? When things don't make sense, and some of you are in that place right now, you got some stuff going on, it doesn't make sense. What do? Well, John Kavanaugh was a Jesuit priest, and a part of his training was to spend a year of service as he kind of was stepping out into this role. And he said in 1975, he was spending a year in service, and he went to Calcutta, India, and he had arranged that he could spend 3 months serving with Mother Teresa in the house of the dying. Those of you that know her story know that she spent most of her entire life, at least her adult life, in this home in Calcutta, India, for people who had been left on the side of the road to die. They had nowhere to go. And she would bring them in, and she would give them dignity in death. She would feed them, she would hold them in her arms, and she would provide dignity for those who had been left alone. So John thought, you know what, no better place for me to serve, to understand, and especially to be with Mother Teresa. He said the first time he saw Mother Teresa, he said she was small in frame, but she was powerful. She was strong, she was determined. So he spends 3 months with her, and he's coming down kind of to the end of the stay, and he's talking about all that's happened, and he's having a conversation with Mother Teresa, and he has a request of her, and he says, Mother Teresa, before I go, would you pray with me and pray for me? And she said, how would you like for me to pray for you? Now he's stepping out on a journey in his life. He's just kind of getting started in ministry. He doesn't know what tomorrow holds. He says, Mother Teresa, pray that I have clarity. And she took a deep breath and she said, I will not. I will pray that you have trust. And he said, but you have such clarity. You seem to know what to do, when to do it. I mean, here you are making such sacrifices. And these were her words. I never had clarity. What I has had is trust. So I will pray that you trust God. Let's go back to what we talked about at the beginning. Every good story has a through line, a narrative, a spine that holds the story together, that weaves throughout. Every story has it. What's your through line? I mean, if you had to put it in a sentence, and you looked at your life, and you looked at the story, what would be the narrative? Would it be, I worried too much? I got angry too often? I felt unworthy? I felt lost? I never could find direction, or I never could be satisfied? Or could that line that weaves throughout your life, that story, that narrative that weaves throughout, could it be, you know, I trusted God. When life didn't make sense, when I didn't understand, I trusted God. When I was tempted to bow to idols, I trusted God. You know, the good thing is that it doesn't matter what the story was when you came through these doors or when you got online. That story can be changed by the power of God from this time on. Now, how do you know you can trust somebody? If they love you. You got some people like that in your life, don't you? You know they love you, and you can trust them. John wrote these words, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. And whoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. We can know beyond the shadow of a doubt because Jesus came, because Jesus died, that he loves us, and we can trust.